This is an exclusive excerpt from the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder.
It's time for another retro interview with a celebrity that is no longer with us. The Academy Awards have just passed, and each year, people not only dish about the winners and their acceptance speeches, they also talk about the clothes they wear. Well, when it comes to the folks who were best known for dishing it out about the fabrics of the Hollywood elite, all have to pay homage to the man who practically made it a blood sport. I'm talking about the famed Mr. Blackwell, who was well known for his worst dress list. Mr. Blackwell died in 2008, but it was 20 years ago, back in June of 1995, that he was one of the first celebrity interviews I did on my old radio show. So I thought at this post-Oscar moment, I would reminisce with one of the most fun interviews we've shared. At the time, Mr. Blackwell was promoting his book entitled From Rags to Bitches. Here is part of that interview now.
A lot of people are familiar with the list that you put out, but there's a lot about your life that I'm sure a lot of people are not familiar with, and it's to a certain degree, there's quite a bit of a hard luck story there, isn't there?
Well, there's a story there of a man that was not born with a great silver spoon in his mouth and a crystal chandelier over his head, and someone who did not drive a Rolls Royce to the nearest, let's say, bistro gardens. There's a story of survival. There's a story of a man born in Brooklyn who did not have even a home to sleep in. There's a story about a man who never knew his father. There's a story about a man who had 3 years of grade school education. And that goes on to Broadway, and that goes on to Hollywood, and all of a sudden the whole world seems to open up, and there is something wonderful and fantastic to talk about. But there's a message here that I think really, really is important. It's a little thing called survival. It's a little thing called have a little faith. It's a little thing about saying, okay, it happened. It wasn't bad. It was only an experience. There's something here about a man who says, I needed love and took it any place it came. It's a man who did a lot of things that other people might have been ashamed of or embarrassed about, but it did not embarrass me. It's a story about a man who lived every alternative lifestyle you can imagine. And now you would probably say, why did you write the book? Why do you reveal yourself when you already have a rather opulent reputation?
Well, why would you do that?
I'm glad you asked. I'm glad you asked. Because it must be, and I remember when I was a much younger man, I remember looking for someone who would listen to me. I remember wanting someone to listen to me. I remember sitting in an alley under a fire escape, crying my eyes out, saying, isn't there anyone who would love me? I remember wanting someone just to hold my hands and say, I'm so glad you're here. I remember having to pay a price when I was in the dress business for an order by having to have a relationship with buyers that would absolutely nauseate me. I remember having wonderful romances in Hollywood with people that would probably say, oh, really? But these people held out their hand and they said, we love you. Even for a moment, we love you.
Okay. Well, you brought up on several occasions the idea of love, and I'm just wondering if a lot of your success and the things you've done in life has been driven by your desire just to be loved.
I think a lot of my success has been driven by the desire to be accepted. If you've ever been alone and never knew your father and never knew where a meal was coming from, all you really wanted was someone to need you for something. And then love became something that was probably the most emotional need you had. And you were absolutely willing to accept it under any condition, any term. And I don't want people who feel the same way that I did to be ashamed or embarrassed. I don't want those people to say, is there something wrong with me? No, there's nothing wrong with any human being that has any desire, different as it may be. There is nothing wrong with any human being who says, all right, I live this way, but I will do it well. I will do it with class, and I will do it with dignity. But, we had terrific times. I worked with Mae West. I have wonderful stories about Mae. I worked with Howard Hughes. I have the most incredible story about Howard Hughes and being under contract to him. I was with the Little Tough Guys, which was another group of the Dead End Kids, which really changed my whole life. It was from that point I came to Hollywood. And coming to Hollywood was the big difference in my having survived. I honestly believe that if Sidney Kingsley Scouts, he was the author of Dead End in 1937, I honestly believe, Peter, and I mean this with all my heart, that if I had not been discovered, I would have been gone. I don't think you survive in that environment. If you make another day, you're lucky. You know how we used to live under a fire escape, Peter? I mean, I'm not asking the question because you couldn't possibly in your wildest dreams imagine this. We would break a milk bottle and hold the neck by the hand. And if anyone came towards us in our sleep, we would reach out and jab. And if we didn't jab, we would probably be killed.
Well, how does somebody in that situation get discovered in the first place? A lot of people don't.
I was very lucky. The show Dead End was a show about boys from the Bowery, boys from very underprivileged neighborhoods. I was extremely lucky they had that show going on Broadway at that time, because any other show would never in a million years have even accepted me. I mean, there was nothing to accept. There was a kid, a slum kid. But when they took a look at me, they said, he looks the part. People will look at him and understand his emotions. That was the main thing. So I went into a road company of Dead End itself. I played Tommy, the leader. I forgot 90% of my lines. But as Sidney Kingsley said, we're not interested in the exact words. What we're trying to show people is there is a society that lives in this manner. Well, from there, I went to Hollywood. Thank heavens, things did turn around a little bit. Mother got little odd jobs. It was after the crash, and we were able to survive it. We got to Hollywood, and the Andrews sisters, mother, was the first one to get me my first job at Universal Studio. Then I have the most wonderful story, Peter, about falling madly infatuated with a girl called Frances Gum. Do you know who that would be?
Judy Garland.
How do you like that? You do know. And then madly in love with this girl. There was absolutely nobody like her. I watched her destroy her own self by the studio. I watched her go from one level to another. I have a lot of this in the book. I thought Deanna Durbin, one of my better friends, who then saved Universal Studio from bankruptcy, would you believe it, who today lives in Paris and married to an extraordinarily wealthy man. And then I went on, and the biggest and most exciting experience I had as a young man probably was going back to Broadway and being on Broadway itself in a show called Catherine Was Great with Mae West. And that was really, I think, the major growing up turning point. There are so many stories in here that if you really can't just keep going on about them.
You've gone from literally the streets of Brooklyn, New York, into the world of Broadway and Hollywood, and that is a major monumental leap on its own.
But you got to remember, we got there through an alley.
Exactly.
We did not get there eating at Club 21.
And then on top of that, the acting career goes okay to a certain degree, but you decide for one reason or another that maybe this is not what you should be doing, and you go into the world of fashion, which is an entirely different direction, and become successful there. I mean, that in itself is another leap that's sometimes hard to believe.
Well, do you know, sometimes people don't let doors open for them. Sometimes people turn things away. People say, well, I could have done it if, or I could have done it but. And that's not the case. There's a lot of things, by the way, that happened in between that. Going in the dress business was a result of doing costumes for a girl that I was managing. And that girl was a nightclub singer. Well, the reviews of her clothing was far better than that of her voice. So when the girl totally bombed out, I took those reviews downtown to a manufacturer and looked around for somebody who would give me a job. I had no idea. I mean, I wasn't bright or brilliant. I was just following very ordinary, common, I suppose, street gut feelings.
So where does your sense of fashion, or where did your sense of fashion first come from?
Where does a boy at 5 years old learn to play Chopin? How does that happen? I think maybe God gives us a wonderful gift and the ability to do these things, and we don't question them. And the most important thing is that we simply go ahead and we do them. The first year I was a designer, I became almost the rage of the fashion industry because I dared defy everybody else who was doing clothes that I thought were not as pretty and did what I believed was beautiful.
That must have annoyed your contemporaries at the time.
Well, they practically blacklisted me. As a matter of fact, the very first ad we ever did, and we did the ad figuring this. Now, I can admit it now. The ads at that time, believe it or not, were $3,000 a page. We were very new in business. So we decided to do an ad in both Harper's Bazaar and Vogue magazine. All right, we were in the dress business. The accountant had told us we were bankrupted unless something major happened, that we just simply didn't have the accounts and we didn't have the money. So we decided on taking the ad, figuring, well, what if I can't pay for it? I mean, what are they going to do? They're going to take a cutting table? They can come and take the cutting table. It wouldn't have made any difference. But I did something so unusual that I became almost the conversation of 7th Avenue.
Was that when you used the ad and just had your own face?
The big portrait of me.
Big portrait of you.
Yeah, which was a very heavy-looking portrait. I mean, very tough-looking, very, very vendetta. I forgot to tell you that Howard Hughes had been the one to change my name from my acting name, which was Dick Ellis, to Richard Blackwell. Following Howard Hughes is when I became a dress designer, and that's who gave me my name. And that whole story is in the book itself, too.
Not only have you become a dress designer, however, you're basically the fashion police with your worst dress list. How did that come about?
Well, in 1960, having been known in Hollywood as, a not altogether dynamite performer, and then they knew I had gone in the dress business, they said to me, would you do a list of the 10 best and the 10 worst dressed people in Hollywood? Now, this was never intended to be an annual.
Now, who was they?
The American Weekly. It was
American Weekly.
A Sunday supplement in newspapers all over the United States. Well, I did the article, outraged half of the people in the world, the other half of it loved it, and that began the image of the man who does the 10 worst dressed women. Now, the first year after it, nobody would touch it. The second year, people began to get curious. By the third year, more than 5 people showed up at a press conference. We tried it every year the same time, but it took 3 full years for it really to take hold. And by the time it took hold, it just exploded wide open. Now nobody thought of me as a dress designer. Nobody thought of me as a kid who had ever been an actor. Most of them didn't even know it. They thought of a man who does the list. And that's what I was basically known for. Just the guy who did the list. They thought I crawled out from under a rock once a year, made a few very acerbic statements, and crawled back under a rock. In the meantime, I had to go back and do a collection 4 times a year. And I loved the lines and I think that's what made it. It was not that I criticized their clothing by telling you I didn't like it because it was green or blue and it had a bow and it had a deep neck or it didn't. I did impression lines. I did lines that, in a way, told you what I thought about their clothing without ever mentioning the clothes. Do you remember in 1992 Gina Davis, when she wore that dress with the mesh hosiery and that big tail behind it at the Academy
Awards?
Academy Awards.
Yes.
Remember that dress?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I put her on the list. She was number 2. But I never mentioned the color of the dress. All I did is I said, Big Bird in heels. A Folies Bergère fiasco. And that answered it best.
You can envision it without ever having seen it.
That's right.
One of the things that's very controversial about the book is it talks about some of the people you've had relationships with. And,
Yes.
and this would come as a surprise to quite a few people. I'm wondering if you've heard from any of the families, friends, and relatives of those you've had relationships with and you talk about in the book, and if they have anything negative or positive to say about it.
No, and do you know something? I don't believe I'm going to. They began to lead completely different lives. You know, we're talking about a good many years ago. I was 20 years old, and they were new in the studios. They were not married. It isn't as if they were married and lived a second kind of a life. These people were never married at that point, and then the studios demanded they get married in order to save their career.
We should mention for those who are listening who have no idea what we're talking about that you've had some relationships with some prominent male actors.
All right, and we can even tell you who they were. It was Tyrone Power, it was Randy Scott, and I will tell you here and now, I'm neither ashamed or embarrassed about it. You see, I had no father. I had nobody who ever gave a darn whether I was, standing, sitting, dead, or alive. And when these people offered me any sense of love, any sense of affection, I grabbed it. I was delighted that somebody cared I was alive. I didn't look at it as anything I had to be ashamed of. And one of the things this book is going to do is going to tell a lot of kids, you can live any life you choose, just do it well. It's going to tell a lot of people it's okay. No one's going to set the rules for you anymore. The rules is do it well, have respect for who you're with, and love.
This story is just that, quite a story. It's a life that has so many twists and turns in it that it could make an interesting movie. If you were making this movie, who would you cast as Mr. Blackwell?
At the very end, I had never thought about the beginning. At the very end of the book, maybe the last 25 years, I would choose John Malkovich.
Why is that?
I think he's an incredible actor. I think he has many faces. I think he can look any way you would choose him to do. And I think he has the ultimate in class.
Well, it certainly is quite the story, as I mentioned, and you've managed to fit quite a life into one book. I thank you for talking with us this evening, and continued success with all you do, sir.
Peter, tell everybody they can have anything in the world they want. Just see it, and don't say, I could have had it, but...
That was part of an interview from June 1995 with Mr. Blackwell. Mr. Blackwell passed away on October 19, 2008. He was a fun guest to talk to. And on another note, this was probably one of the first times that I dealt with Hollywood publicist Harlan Boll, who was like a son to Mr. Blackwell. Harlan has been one of the best in the business and also one of the nicest people you'd ever meet. I've had the pleasure and honor to work with him over the years, to book a myriad of Hollywood legends for this and previous programs. By the way, you could also hear the full Mr. Blackwell interview on my website at thestuffile.com. Click on Celebrity Audio Files, and you'll find the interview with Mr. Blackwell and also interviews with others. They're all listed in alphabetical order, and you can play them right off the page.
You've just heard an exclusive excerpt from the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder. To hear any or all of the full hour-long shows, visit thestuffile.com. Stuff is spelled S-T-U-P-H. That's thestuffile.com. A presentation of Flying Fish Communications.